Okay, right, 2 o'clock, time to start. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is keeping well, still isolating and looking after yourselves, but certainly some good weather to enjoy. Here we go with the beginning of June's program. Brian Nathan, known to you all. Some of you might have I think I've mentioned before, might well have heard Brian talking about Jewish celebration of Jewish humour before. I think I said also that the first time I ever came to say Brian did this session and I never stopped laughing. Second time I heard it, I still didn't stop laughing. And I'm sure with this third session that he's doing for us, I still won't stop laughing. So, you know, this is a real good feel good factor session. So Brian, over to you and make us laugh, please.
Thank you very much, and certainly appreciate everybody being indoors in this fantastic weather we're having. A bank robber goes into a bank, shoots into the ceiling and tells everybody to lie on the floor. And as he does this, his balaclava slips. He shouts, "Did you see my face?" At the first person as he's walking through on the floor. He said, "Yes," and he shoots him dead. The next person he comes to, "Did you see my face?" "Yes," shoots him dead. Comes to the next person, again, "Did you see my face?" No, I didn't, but my husband did." Now, before I celebrate Jewish humour with you, I'm going to ask two questions briefly. What is humour, and what's particular about our Jewish humour? I'm going to start with those two questions, try and answer them, and then go on to all the examples. Because humor is life enhancing. It's really something, it's one of life's real pleasures. And it doesn't decline with age, remains the same. And for some of us, it actually even gets better. But it's very personal. We all see things differently. And humor is one area where for one person's funny bone, it may just be another person's rheumatism. Now, the first joke, when I'm talking to a crowd, when I see them, I know that some of them have laughed at that and some of them haven't. So right at the beginning, you realize everybody may see it slightly differently. And what is it that makes us laugh or smile? Well, it's usually the element of surprise. And as we've just heard from Stuart, there's not a lot of surprise now with this. I have given this story a number of times. And if the joke is obvious, predictable punchline, then generally speaking, it's not very funny. It's got to surprise the reader. Some of these stories I'm sure you've heard. There may be some of you who've heard all the bits before and the recorded bits. But with true humor, it does have a lasting element. And even though you remember it, maybe not in great detail, it still raises a smile or a laugh when you hear it once again. So I hope that's how it's going to be today. It can also be intellectual, actually, and the joke becomes apparent there's special knowledge. Someone has special knowledge. They understand clever words and special meanings. And generally, when people are laughing like that, they're actually patting themselves on the back. They say, well, I've seen that, you know, I'm rather clever, and I know what's funny about that. Humor can also be cruel. Quite often, laughing at the misfortunes of others, it can be used to ridicule people of authority or power. And pricking pomposity and bringing people or situations down is one of the best results that humor can obtain. And I think being relevant to what's happening today, my first item was really about a mask, actually. And now talking about this, if you're seeing, there are lots of humorous things about the comings and goings. And there's also humorous things about Trump. And it's the only way sometimes people can actually get back at people they think are doing things wrong or they're not very happy with. So generally that's humor. What about Jewish humor? Now, Isaiah Berlin asked the question, he said, what do we Jews all have in common? And he went on to answer it himself, which he often did. He said, a sense of unease in society. Nowhere do we Jews feel entirely at home. For most of our existence, we have been a minority, and usually a very small minority, and often oppressed. Now, humor has been one pleasure which is available to us, laughing sometimes at the oppressors, as I mentioned then, people in authority, but we also laugh at ourselves. It helps, at our own foibles, at our misfortunes. And it's a valuable escape valve. It offers consolation through laughter in times of distress. And self-deprecation is often central to Jewish humor. Sometimes it's used to make us fit in and even downplay some Jewish achievements or some of our characteristics. In recent times, we've had Mort Sahl in America, probably the first and one of the best of the modern day satirists. And then we had Lenny Bruce over there. Jackie Mason is the present one. Over here, we've had Ben Elton, Ali G, David Baddiel, Matt Lucas, and Stephen Fry. They're all Jewish, all doing much the same thing. They are actually using satire to laugh at some of life's unfairness. But perhaps topping them all was a brilliant Jewish satirist whose light shone very brightly, but very briefly. And he's still alive today, and now an old man. It's Tom Lehrer. He had a take on the Boy Scouts, the atomic bomb, poisoning pigeons in the park, I Hold Your Hand in Mine. They're all minor masterpieces. And he actually said, apparently, that satire was dead when he heard that Kissinger had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he went back to teaching mathematics at Harvard. Apparently, he was a brilliant teacher. But many of the songs are still just as relevant today as they were when he penned them over 50 years ago. And I'm going to play now one of them, one of the rarer ones, but it's a great example of what I said about we Jews, we can laugh at ourselves. He's Jewish, and you'll hear from this, he is laughing at us and at himself. Here we go.
During National Brotherhood Week, various special events are arranged to drive home the message of brotherhood. This year, for example, on the first day of the week, Malcolm X was killed, which gives you an idea of how effective the whole thing is. I'm sure we all agree that we ought to love one another, and I know there are people in the world who do not love their fellow human beings, and I hate people like that. Here's a song about National Brotherhood Week. Oh, the white folks hate the black folks, and the black folks hate the white folks. To hate all but the right folks is an old established rule, but during National Brotherhood Week, National Brotherhood Week, Lena Horne and Sheriff Clark are dancing cheek to cheek. It's fun to eulogize the people you despise, as long as you don't let them in your school. Oh, the poor folks hate the rich folks, and the rich folks hate the poor folks. All of my folks hate all of your folks. It's American as apple pie. But during National Brotherhood Week, National Brotherhood Week, New Yorkers love the Puerto Ricans 'cause it's very chic. Step up and shake the hand of someone you can't stand. You can tolerate him if you try. Oh, the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews. But during National Brotherhood Week, National Brotherhood Week, it's national, everyone smile at one anotherhood week. Be nice to people who are inferior to you. It's only for a week, so have no fear. Be grateful that it doesn't last all year.
There we are. Now, I'm not a Talmud maven, but I'm told that Jewish humor goes back to the Talmud a long, long way. Elaborate legal arguments and situations were often seen as so absurd to be humorous. They were used to tease out the reason of religious law. Is one allowed to ride in an aeroplane on Shabbos? One of the questions. Yes, as long as the seatbelt is remained fastened, because then it's considered that you're actually wearing the plane. Now, the emphasis on language and on the argumentative patterns of Talmudic reasoning have provided us with a style of thinking and a linguistic tradition that prizes and rewards quick thinking and a quick tongue. In this tradition of verbal dexterity, I'm going to offer a few examples. First one comes from Freud. Freud said, although he wasn't generally known as a humorist, he said, what comes between fear and sex? After a pause, he gave the answer, fünf. A wife asks her husband, please go shopping, get me 1 carton of milk, and if they have eggs, get 6. So her husband returns home with 6 cartons of milk. And of course, the wife says, why on earth did you do that? He said, well, they had eggs. 2 rabbis go into a Chinese restaurant and they ask the waiter if he knows if there are any Chinese Jews. So no Chinese Jews is the answer. They ask again the same answer. They're really not satisfied. They say, please go in and check with the chef in the kitchen. He comes back, he says, cook says definitely no Chinese Jews, just orange Jews and tomato Jews. A drugstore in America, have to think about this, has a sign outside the shop, outside the drugstore, a chemist. It says, we dispense with accuracy. Einstein said 2 things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And he said, and I'm not sure about the universe. Another one, how many people are there working in your office? About half. So there are a few examples of verbal dexterity. And this is an unintended one, which a distant member of my family came about. They had a car, it wouldn't start. She called the AA and they managed to get it going and told her it was okay, it's okay. She said, what's the matter? She said, oh, they said, well, it was just a flat battery. That was the reply, to which the question was, what shape should it have been? But Jewish humor goes much further than just a funny punchline. It often involves situations and storytelling, and often the journey is just as funny or even funnier than the ending. An example of this later. The sort of things which we talk about, Jewish sensibility, marriage, families, food, sex, business, personal appearance, religion, tailoring. A Jewish tailor goes up to his friend, who's also a tailor, grabs him by the lapels, holds him out, shouts at him, if I catch you with my wife again, suddenly looking closer, he says, call that a buttonhole? On to some examples of particular Jewish humor, starting with food. You probably know the old joke from Bloom's. Sadly, Bloom's no longer with us. The waiter would come up to you at the end and say, was anything all right? Nowadays, they come up and they say, was everything all right? You haven't photographed the food. Then there's a story about the Frum family. They were eating at their Bubbas, and Yossi starts eating as soon as he gets his plate, and the father says, please wait, we haven't yet said our prayer. He says, I don't have to reply. Wait, says Yossi, I don't need to wait. Of course you do, says his mother. Don't we always say a prayer before we eat in our house? Yes, he says, Yossi. He said, that's true. He said, but this is with Bubba, and she knows how to cook. Have you ever wondered, do illiterate people get the full effect from alphabet soup? Now, this one's a warning, actually. This is a warning you should take care of. You must be careful eating chopped liver at Pesach, because medical experts in London have published a paper that concludes that at Pesach, when eating the Seder, you shouldn't eat chopped liver and cirrhosis together, because research shows it can lead to cirrhosis of the liver. An old man shuffles slowly into an ice cream parlor. He pulls himself slowly and painfully up onto a stool, catches his breath, and he orders a banana split. And the waitress rather kindly says, crushed nuts? He says, no, arthritis. Anyhow, moving on now to marriage and families. Men don't care what's on television. They only care what else is on television. Why do Jewish divorces cost so much? Because they're worth it. Jaime asked his wife one day, he says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate me as a lover? And she replies, She said, you know, I'm no good at fractions. Two old men, they're talking together. So I hear you're getting married, says one to the other. Yes. He said, do I know her? No, I don't think so. Is she good looking? Not really. Is she a good cook? A good cook? No. Well, lots of money. Perhaps she's got lots of money. He said, no. Is she good in bed? He said, well, I don't know yet. He said, why on earth would you want to marry her? Well, she can still drive. Two entirely different old men. Again, one tells his friend, I'm getting married. So says the friend, I suppose you lied about your age. You told her you were 70. So the friend says, yes, I lied about my age. I told her I was 90. Dr. Levy, known for his miraculous cures for arthritis, got a waiting room full of people. A little old lady, completely bent in half, shuffles in, slowly leaning on a walking stick, and she goes into the doctor's office. Amazingly, she emerges quite soon afterwards, completely erect, and with her head held high. And a woman sitting in the waiting room saw this. She walks over to her and says, I've never seen anything like it. It's a miracle. You walked in there, I saw you went in bent, and you've come out, you're perfectly erect. What did he do? Miracle, schmiracle, he said. He gave me a longer stick. Another old man, he goes to his doctor to get a physical, and a few days later, the doctor sees him walking down the street with a gorgeous young woman on his arm. And next time he sees him, the doctor says, you're really doing great, aren't you? Well, says the old man, I'm just doing what you told me, doc. You know, you said get a hot mama and be cheerful. That's what I'm doing. The doctor says, I didn't say that. I said, you've got a heart murmur and be careful. Mr. Cohen is in court. The judge says, asks him, he said, how old are you, Mr. Cohen? He said, I'm 84 years old, Kanena Horror. So not satisfied. The judge says, we just want to know the age. So he says, again, 84, Kanena Horror. After the third time, he's getting very frustrated. Just give us your age. Doesn't work at all. But there happens to be a Jewish barrister there. He says to the judge, if you leave it to me, I can deal with this. So he said, okay, go ahead. He says, Mr. Cohen, Kanena Horror, how old are you? Mrs. Cohen, I hope there's some reaction. I don't know because I can't see many of you. So I hope there's some reaction. Mrs. goes to the beauty parlor for 2 hours. And that was just to get an estimate. She got a mud pack, and for 2 days she looked great. And then the mud fell off. Mr. Cohen told his wife, he said, you know, I'm seeing a psychiatrist. So she said to him, I'm seeing a psychiatrist, 2 plumbers, and a pop star. Mr. Levy said, he said, my wife is not very bright. She saw someone the other day stealing our car. And when I said to her, did you see what they looked like? She said, no, I didn't, but I made a note of the number plate. Back to the medics again. A Jewish woman goes to the doctor, and in the waiting room, to her surprise, she meets an old friend. They have a good muttel. They have a lovely, next week she's there again, and the friend's there again. This happens 3 weeks in a row. And then on the next occasion, the friend's not there. And she's very disappointed. But the week after, they're back again. And she says to her friend, she says, you weren't here last week. What was the matter? She said, well, I wasn't well. A young boy says to his mother, she says, Mummy, where do we all come from? Mother says, well, you came from me and Daddy, and I came from Grandma and Grandpa. It goes back like that, all the way back to Adam and Eve. He's not really satisfied with this. He thinks, I'm not sure. He goes and asks his father. And his father says, he says, well, you came from Mummy and me, and then we came from the grandparents, and that goes back to Adam and Eve. I said, and then there were the cavemen, and before the cavemen, it goes back to the apes. So now he's got 2 stories. He goes back to his mother and he says, Daddy told me something different. What's the difference? So she says, well, he was talking about his side of the family, and I was talking about my side of the family. What is it about Jewish philosophers? You know, a non-Jewish philosopher, he ponders if a tree falls in a wood and no one's there, does it make a noise? But a Jewish philosopher thinks differently. He says, if a man speaks in a wood and his wife isn't there, is he still wrong? What is Jewish Alzheimer's? Jewish Alzheimer's is when you forget everything except the guilt. And another thing, how can you tell a Jewish nymphomaniac? It's a woman who has sex even on the day that she's had her hair done. Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm schizophrenic, and so am I. Now, moving on to a group of buddies at Hartspawn. These were golfing buddies, so it's all local. This is very local here. All in their 40s, and they discussed where should they meet. They've been playing now for 10 years. Let's have a celebration lunch. And finally, they agreed we'll go to the Grove because it wasn't far from the course, and the waitresses there, they're very young, good looking. They show lots of cleavage, and they wear very short shorts. So that's where they go. 10 years later, they're still together. They're playing. It's now 50. They say, let's discuss again, have a special lunch. Where should we go? And finally, they agreed, we'll meet at the Grove because the food and the service are very good there. And they've got lots of televisions. We can watch the sport, and their wine selection is excellent. 10 years later, they're now age 60, and again, they get together. Another 10 years, you know, what are we going to do? We should have another lunch. They finally agree, we'll meet at the Grove because there's plenty of parking there. We can dine very quietly in peace, and really it's good value for money. Moving on another 10 years. It's a long story, this one. They're now 70, and they discuss where should we meet, time for another celebration lunch. Finally, they agree, let's go to the Grove because the restaurant is wheelchair accessible and there's a toilet for the disabled there. Obvious place to go. Amazingly, all of them are quite fit and they all managed to reach 80. And they say, well, we've done it again, another 10 years. Where should we go? We must decide. So they finally decide we must meet at the Grove because they've never been there before. Two officers in the States, they call their station, they sergeant, we have a terrible case here. There's a Jewish woman, she's just shot her husband dead because he stepped on the floor that she'd mopped for Passover. Terrible, says the sergeant. Have you arrested her? We said, no, sir, the floor's still wet. Waiting in a lay-by, a policeman sees speeding for a speeding offence. A policeman sees a car is puttering along very, very slowly on the A22. He's standing there, and so slow that the officer feels it's actually dangerous. So he stops them, and in it there's 5 elderly Jewish ladies. All of them except the driver. They're white as ghosts. And the driver says to the policeman, I said, why have you stopped me? I was doing exactly the speed limit. So the policeman explains, you don't, the A22, you don't have to go at 22. That's not the speed limit. You can go much faster. It's 30 miles an hour here. So keeping a straight face, he says, now you go along and you can do better. But incidentally, why are all these women sitting here? They all seem to be in a terrible state. Are they all well? He said, well, they're okay. They're rather quiet, but we've just come off the A90. Mrs. Levy visits her son Joshua for dinner, and he lives there. He's got a female roommate called Janet. She can't help noticing that Janet's very, very pretty, and she starts to wonder if there's anything special going on between them. Reading her thoughts, her son volunteers. He said, I know what you're thinking, Mum. He said, but I assure you that Janet and I are just roommates, absolutely nothing more in it. About a week after the visit, Janet says to Joshua, he said, ever since your mother's been here, I can't find the silver sugar bowl. Do you think there's any chance she may have taken it? So he said, well, I don't know. So he sent his mother an email. He says, I'm not saying you did take the sugar bowl, and I'm not saying you didn't take the sugar bowl. He said, but the fact is that ever since you came to see us, the sugar bowl has been missing. Several days later, he gets a reply. He says, I'm not saying you do sleep with Janet, and I'm not saying you don't sleep with Janet. But the fact is that if she was sleeping in her own bed, she would have found the sugar bowl by now. This is an American joke. This is very American. Abe and Esther, they're flying to Australia for a 2-week vacation, celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. And suddenly the captain announces, ladies and gentlemen, he said, I'm afraid there's some very bad news. Our engines are failing and I have to attempt an emergency landing. Luckily, I can see just below us, there's an uncharted island and we should be able to land on the beach there. But once we land there, the odds are we may never be rescued. We may have to live on that island for the rest of our lives. And thanks to the skill of this pilot, they do manage to. It's a very, very remote island. They land safely. An hour later, Abe turns to his wife and he says, did you send our charity pledge check to the Beth Shalom synagogue? No, she says, no. Abe's still shaken. He says, as he comes round, he says, did you send the check to the United Jewish Appeal? No, she said, I forgot that one as well. She says, one last thing, Esther, did you remember to send the check for the synagogue building fund? Oh, she said, forgive me, Abe, sir, I didn't send that one either. So Abe grabs her, he gives her the biggest hug and kiss in 40 years. He says, she's very surprised. She said, what's that for? He said, well, now I know they'll find us. I don't know if any of you remember, I can't see everybody here, but there was a true story about the king of Lampedusa. That was a Jewish story a long, long time ago, which has a little relevance there. So you can see how our humor has health, sex, families, and religion. They're very Jewish themes. And of course, they're themes for everybody. And many of the great comedians are Jewish. A lot of them have been American. The Marx Brothers were an example. And there was a talk about the Marx, I think, about 3 or 4 weeks ago. But Groucho was wonderful because this was tradition. He actually laughed at people. He pricked pomposity of people, and he did it with words. I've got a few examples, which I don't think were used in the last talk. Groucho said, I never forget a face, but in your case, I'm glad to make an exception. I've had a wonderful evening, but this wasn't it. So I didn't like the play, but I saw it under unfavorable circumstances. The curtains had gone up. Another one, he said, I remember the first time I had sex, I've kept the receipt. And another one of his clever words, play on words. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like a banana. And when Yiddish was still widely spoken, Mickey Katz was the star. He performed very Jewish parodies on popular songs, lively music, and he actually was a very good clarinetist, a klezmer clarinetist. But I didn't realize this until I did look into it. Not all the Jews in America were comfortable with him. And some of the organizations made their feelings known. They banned records by Mickey Katz. I don't know quite why. I think they can still raise a smile. Although I wonder, does it mean anything to the younger generation? I don't know. But this is an example of Mickey Katz.
To the Crockett, king of the Lancey Street. To the Crockett, this boy you got to meet.
Born in the wilds of the Lancey Street, home of gefilte fish and kosher meat. Handy with a knife for hairs you've seen. He flicked him a chicken when he was only 3.
To Crockett.
He sat in the sun and geracket in gebacket.
To Crockett, king of the Lancey Street.
In 1813 he fought Indianers. Then came the Litvaks and the Galicianers. A figure-hugged redskins all over the statel. He never lost his head, he never lost his shaitel.
To Crockett.
He chewed tobacco und gehisst und geracket.
To Toby Crockett,
king of the Delancey Street. He went down south looking for a maidel, met a little Tsatskelek called Daisy Fradel. From there on far they came to the hippie, elected him president of the Benin, Mississippi.
Mazel tov, Toby Crockett,
A mazel tov de mame und der alte Crockett,
Mazel tov, Toby Crockett,
king of the Delancey Street. He went up west on his featherless sleigh, took along Fredele, his Bible chain. Schleim hat gefliegt wie ein Airplane. He got the last Vegas ahead of the train.
Toby Crockett,
He walked up to the crepe table with a full pocket.
Toby Crockett, king of the Delancey Street.
He shot like a gambler, einer of the belt. Up came 2 sixes and dread the geld. He felt very sad, that's my opinion. He would have said Kaddish, but he couldn't find a minion.
Toby Crockett,
Verloren die Hasten, he went on naked.
Toby Crockett,
He's back on the Delancey Street.
Toby Crockett, he's back on the Delancey Street.
Bim, bum, bim, bum, bum.
Toby Crockett, he's back.
So there we are, Toby Crockett. Now, my next example is someone who really hit the jackpot with one of his songs way back in 1963. His actual story is a rather sad one. He took his mother's maiden name because his father abandoned him. He was fortunate to live next door to Harpo Marx, who invited him to sing his parodies at the end of the parties that he gave for showbiz and friends. And that's how Alan Sherman was first noticed. His heyday was very short. He lived only to the age of 48, dying of emphysema. But his really big hit as an example, it's a wonderful example of something where we all know what's coming, but it's so perfect that we don't mind hearing it again, I hope. I feel it's very Jewish, although there's no religious element in it at all.
Hello, mother. Hello, father. Here I am at Camp Granada. Camp is very entertaining, and they say we'll have some fun if it stops raining. I went hiking with Joe Spivey. He developed poison ivy. You remember Leonard Skinner? He got ptomaine poisoning last night after dinner. All the counselors hate the waiters, and the lake has alligators, and the head coach wants no sissies, so he reads to us from something called Ulysses. Now I don't want this should scare you, but my bunkmate has malaria. You remember Jeffrey Hardy? They're about to organize a searching party. Take me home, oh mother, father, take me home. I hate Granada, don't leave me out in the forest where I might get eaten by a bear. Take me home, I promise I will not make noise or mess the house with other boys. Oh, please don't make me stay. I've been here one whole day. Dearest father, darling mother, how's my precious little brother? Let me come home if you miss me. I would even let Aunt Bertha hug and kiss me. Wait a minute, it stopped hailing. Guys are swimming, guys are sailing, playing baseball. Gee, that's better. Mata fata, kindly disregard this letter.
There we are. Around that time, there was someone in England actually doing much the same sort of thing as was happening in America, using well-known melodies to write musicals and then making them very Jewish. They were targeted actually only at Jewish audiences, and I think they were all amateur things. And I wonder if any of you remember Alf Vogel. Just for old time's sake, and because some of you may even have acted in some of his performances, this is what humor was like in those days, actually. I think it's rather dated now, but these are two short extracts of his. It was a show called the Strudel Prince, and he had other shows like Mine Fair Sadie. Most of the humor is actually classic schmutter trade jokes, and they rather faded, I think, now, but perhaps there's a little laugh here and there. These are two short extracts from the Strudel Prince.
Our story begins in a little-known kingdom of Schmatagonia. The year is 1930, or for you, 1929. Schmatagonia is situated on the top of the Humour Mountains, west of Transylvania, north of Bavaria, and halfway between Minsk and Plinsk. The wealth of the kingdom is derived from its production of high-quality wool, which is produced by the little sheep which schlep to the top of the mountain, where special grass grows in abundance. It's this diet that causes such rapid growth of the world's finest wool. This wool grows so fast, the sheep have to be sheared 3 times a year. Fantastic! It was boom time in Schmatagonia. Everybody was rich. New buildings were being constructed everywhere. A new shul was being built, but no one went there. They preferred the other one. Everyone was living the high life. There was smoked salmon and salt beef for everybody. And then, out of the blue, catastrophe. Synthetics were invented. Polyester, terylene. The demand dropped for Schmatagonia's high-grade wool, and so did the price. There was doom and gloom everywhere. People were beating their chests and shouting, "Oy vey," and other Jewish expressions. Business was really schwach. Even the people who didn't pay weren't buying. They were queuing up to jump from the highest building. If they couldn't find a building, they built one. But cometh the moment, cometh the man. His name was Sammy Starker. He was a tall fella, 6'3", with his hair cut, 5'1". He was a famous coat manufacturer, but he'd gone up so many times they called him the astronaut. A flamboyant character, he always did things in style. Even his creditors' meetings were catered. He rallied the villagers. He called a meeting. "Do not panic," he cried. "Let us stand shoulder pad to shoulder pad. Don't be downhearted. We'll protect our businesses. We will fight them with every penny we owe."
And this one shows they were up to tough.
You might think you've missed your chances, been to all those Jewish dances. Why not try the internet to find the girl you've not met yet? An advert placed in the JC, it could decide your destiny. If you are lucky, you will meet her and you'll be a king. Find a girl who you'll get used to. She should be a booster. Can she cook a stew or chicken? Does she make your heart rate quicken? Does she lift your spirits higher? If she can, it's up a fire. If she does,
sublime. With the right girl, things will be so sweet, and you'll find your life will be complete. Hey!
Now, I don't know if any of you actually were in some of those performances. And as I said, I think it's rather dated, but at the time they were very relevant. And some of you may remember the next example. This is a gentleman psychiatrist who was also a stand-up comedian. His titles range from What to Do Until the Psychiatrist Comes to Anyone Who Goes to a Psychiatrist Needs His Head Examined. It was a great success in all the English-speaking countries, apparently also on the cruise liners at the time, but he now seems to have sunk really without trace. But giving this talk, as I have done a few times, many people remember him. They saw him at the Bournemouth hotels, and one couple said that they asked him back for a meal after a performance. This is a short extract from one of his talks, which was called The Joys and Love of Marriage.
You know, about a couple married 30 years, during which only the first 5 years were gloriously happy. He was in the army. They came to a lawyer, they asked for a divorce. They asked the lawyer to divide all their possessions 50-50, which he did right down the middle, 50-50, to a penny. When it came to the children, they had 3 children. He says, you take 2, you take 1. The husband said, why should I take 1? Let her take 1. I want 2. They argued so long, the lawyer got so fed up, he said, look, go home, stay married another year, have another baby, and then come back. And 2 for you, 2 for you. The husband said, very nice, very nice. What if we should have twins? And then he sent us home for another year. We came back twins again. The wife looked at him and said, look what's talking. If I had to depend on him, I wouldn't have had the 3. One woman said to me, Dr. Banks, look at me. She says, you think I'll be happy when I'm married? Why do people think marriage will change them? It never does. If you're neurotic and miserable before marriage, you're going to be just as neurotic and miserable after marriage. With one exception, you'll make 2 people neurotic and miserable. One woman said to her husband, did you know why you were sleeping last night? In your sleep, you were cursing me? He said, who was sleeping? You may know about the clothing salesman in New York City who won a prize, the best salesman. And the prize was a weekend in Paris with his wife. And while she was unpacking at the hotel in Paris, he decided he'd have a stroll on the Champs-Élysées. And just as soon as he walked out on the street, one of these business girls approached him. It's a great business, you know. You sell it, you still have it. No markdowns, no closeouts. She says, monsieur, you want to have a good time? $50. Is you crazy? I'll give you $5. No, monsieur, $50. $5. She walked off. An hour later, he's walking with his wife. She sees him and says, pardon, monsieur, you see what you get for $5? They Peter the pearly gates, who were admitting all the newcomers, whether he sent them inside or downstairs, depended on. Noticed one man on the line. He said, yes, I recognize you. You loved money so much, you even married a woman named Penny. Down you go. Second fellow, I recognize you too. You love jewelry so much, you even married a woman named Ruby. Down you go. The third man turned to his wife. He said, come on, Fanny, let's get the hell out of here.
So there we are, Dr. Murray Banks. And I'm back. No time to cover all the famous Jewish comedians, but I must just mention Jackie Mason. He's now 92, not going quite as strongly as in the past. He says that he's so old that people are afraid to buy tickets in advance now. is another example of someone who some Jews find embarrassing, though they find him funny. They don't really want to hear him in an audience with any non-Jews. As he says, he's too Jewish. He's followed exactly the way of Groucho and others, laughing at people in power, pricking their pomposity. Also unmistakably Jewish, but in quite a different way, as a successful comedian, scriptwriter, actor, musician, playwright, and film director, which isn't bad for someone who dropped out of university because he had poor grades. I think you probably know a lot of Woody Allen's history, 3 marriages, relationships with most of the leading ladies, a new film almost every year. In fact, he was headlined in the papers, I think, last weekend. His stand-up performances early on were terrific. I thought they were brilliant, and there were some on the BBC. He's the example I mentioned earlier of a comedian where much of the humor is in the telling, not necessarily the punchline. His general attitude, his demeanor, clever use of language, they're all very noticeably Jewish. Just one quote from him. He said, "What if everything that we see is an illusion and nothing exists?" He said, "In that case, I definitely overpaid for my carpet." Now, another American who started off singing serious songs in Yiddish, but with his ebullient sense of humor, a bit like a one-man Marx Brothers, soon changed this to gibberish, and David Daniel Kaminsky became Danny Kaye. A brilliant performer. I have given a talk all about him. He could switch from humor to pathos at will, had a special talent for tongue twisters, and also, certainly on stage, a very warm, likable persona. In 1948, he came to England, gave many performances at the Palladium, wowed the audiences, sitting on the stage at the front and just talking to them very confidentially. Usually, when I give the talk, everybody there were at those performances and remember one. I mustn't leave out some noticeable Jewish women comedians or writers. Over in the UK a few years ago was Bette Midler. Her humor is very extreme. You have to be very careful. If you enjoy it, it's great, but you really must know what you're letting yourself in for. Then there's Goldie Hawn, Amy Schumer, who's a young lady, and then Joan Rivers was another one. Over here, we've got Maureen Lipman, a great actress, but possibly best remembered for her BT ads. American Jewish lady who had a way with words was Dorothy Rothschild. She was better known as Dorothy Parker. Just a few examples from Dorothy Parker. She speaks 18 languages and she can't say no in any of them. One more drink and I'd have been under the host. The most beautiful words in the English language are check enclosed. That is almost now quite dated, actually. Just before I'm going to the last subject, there's a few one-liners. These are all from Jewish comedians, a few one-liners. If at first you don't succeed, so much for skydiving. There was a girl knocking on my hotel room all last night. Finally, I let her out. My wife was afraid of the dark. Then she saw me naked. Now she's afraid of the light. A girl phoned me the other day and she said, "Come over, there's no one here." I went over and there was nobody there. The other day I put on a shirt and the button fell off. I picked up my briefcase, the handle came off, and now I'm afraid to go to the loo. So one other one, which I hope isn't appropriate, hasn't been appropriate today, but it says, the human brain starts working the moment you're born, and it never stops until you stand up to speak in public. So now finally, I'm going back to something which has become almost part of our religion. It was put together by 2 non-Jews in New York, although the cast are mainly Jews. You don't have to be Jewish, brings to life a time, particularly in the middle of the last century. The mid-European accents could still be heard, and they were part of every family's Jewish history. I'm not sure if that's true today, if it's so much, but certainly people of our age can appreciate what it was like. So I hope you don't mind hearing them just once more. This is for old time's sake. There's 3 examples from that, and here they are.
The reading of the will.
May I have your attention, please? This is the last will and testament of our dear friend and relative, Samuel B. Cohen. I, Samuel Benjamin Cohen, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. Number 1, to my son, my beautiful boy Sheldon, my firstborn, who made me proud of him all my life, a fine son, a good husband, a wonderful father, and the best dentist in the United States. To my son Sheldon, I bequeath tax-free $1 million. Wonderful.
Isn't that magnificent?
Good luck, Sheldon. Number 2, to my beautiful daughter Jane with a Y. To that lovely child who always got high marks and helped her mother with the dishes when we couldn't afford a maid, who got a scholarship to Hunter College, who for a long time has been a little too particular, or she'd be married already. To my lovely daughter Jane with a Y, tax-free $1 million.
Such a generous man.
Isn't that beautiful?
Mazel tov. Number 3, to my beautiful wife Miriam, friend, companion, love of my life. To the lovely Miriam, I give with pleasure everything that's not in her name already. The white Chrysler Imperial with the white sidewalls and the Prince's telephone, the Picasso from the back of the store, my Arnold Palmer golf clubs with a new leather bag, and tax-free $2 million in cash. Enjoy, sweetheart, enjoy. What a marvelous husband.
An angel, not a man, an angel.
The Picasso from back of the store and everything.
Number 4, to my brother-in-law Louis, who lived with us all of his life, who never had to do a day's work, who knew how to handicap the ponies better than anybody, who only smoked the finest cigars, mine. To my brother-in-law Louis, who all his life said I would never remember him in my will. Hello, Louis.
The jury. This court will please come to order. Mr. Rabinowitz, you are the foreman of the jury. Have you reached a verdict?
Judge, Your Honor, we have been listening to the facts in this case for 6 weeks, and it has been a wonderful experience for us all. We, the jury, would like to thank you for the way you have conducted this case.
Thank you, Mr. Rabinowitz. But the verdict, please.
Certainly, Your Honor. We, the jury, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Fine, Mr. Landsberg, the lovely Mrs. Berkowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Rabinowitz.
You're welcome.
Mr. Rabinowitz, the verdict.
Coming, Your Honor. Mr. Goldberg, Mr. Katz, Mr. Stein, Mrs. Cantor, Mr.
I'm not lovely.
The lovely Mrs. Cantor. Lovely.
Mr. Rabinowitz.
Mr. Finkelstein, Mr. Bloom, and Mr. Pinkish the Furrier. Your Honor, the 12 of us have spent the past 4 days in the jury room debating this case. And we examined the evidence pro and con, in backwards and forwards, to decide in the American way, did he or didn't he do it?
Mr. Rabinowitz, the verdict, and now.
Immediately, Your Honor. We, the jury, after careful deliberation on this case, have decided we shouldn't mix in.
A call from Long Island.
Hello?
Hello, Mama.
Hello, darling. How are you?
Terrible, Mama. Terrible.
What is it, sweetheart? Tell Mama.
Oh, Mama.
What?
Mama. We're snowed in here.
Oh.
The car wouldn't start this morning. I think both kids have the measles.
Oh.
The doctor can't come until 5 o'clock. I'm coming down with a cold. The freezer is broken and all the food is spoiled. And the house is a mess. And on top of that, Mama, 20 ladies from my Hadassah chapter are coming for lunch at 1 o'clock. Mama, what am I gonna do?
Don't worry, sweetheart. Mother is here. First of all, I'll go to the supermarket and I'll pick up to eat. Then I'll take the subway to the Long Island Railroad and I'll take the train.
Oh, Mama,
Please, darling, it's only an hour and a half to the bus. And then I'll take the bus, and from where the bus stopped, I'll walk the 14 blocks to your house. And for you, darling, I'll put the children to bed, and for you, I'll change the sheets and I'll give them an aspirin so they shouldn't yell, and I'll clean up the house, and I'll cook something nice for the 20 ladies. They'll love it. Just don't worry, darling. Everything will be okay. Isn't that what a mother is for?
Oh, Mama, thank you. I feel so much better.
By the way, sweetheart, if it's snowing and the car wouldn't start this morning, how did Sam get to work?
Sam? What Sam?
Sam, your husband.
My husband's name is Paul. Is this Tremont 71166?
No, this is Tremont 71177.
Does that mean you're not coming?
So there we are. I hope that I've succeeded in celebrating Jewish humor with you today, because laughter really is the best medicine, and I think that we Jews know the prescription.
Brian, thank you so much. I've sat here laughing, even at the ones I've heard before. You know, even things like Alan Sherman, hello mother, hello father. I don't know how many times I've heard that, but I still enjoy it. You don't have to be Jewish, and those jokes there, they're as good as ever. And I like the one about from Murray Banks about the is walking about in Paris and only $5 with his wife. So you've made me laugh. I've been watching other people. I think you've made them laugh as well, and you've certainly made our afternoon. So as you always do, thank you so much for your time and for your input. And in fact, yes, let's have a round of applause. And we look forward, Brian, you're doing the last Tuesday in
All being well, yes.
And
Different altogether. That's a music one.
Tunes of the 60s, if I remember right.
That's correct. Yeah.
So thank you so much once again. We always enjoy your efforts. You entertain us well, and we look forward to your session at the end of June. So thank you, everybody. I hope you've had a good afternoon. I hope you have had a good laugh, and I hope you all feel better for it. Now you can go and sit in the sun and have a nice cup of tea and a piece of cake or whatever you want to do for the rest of the afternoon. Nice to have seen you all. Keep well, keep safe, and keep fit, and keep smiling. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.